Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'd also like to begin by congratulating Frank van Kreuningen on the success of the concept of the Spinoza Day, which is a marvelous thing. I agree with him entirely that to see such a very large attendance here today is certainly a sign of his relevance and significance as a philosopher, but also his relevance and significance for our time. And also I want to thank everyone for coming and listening, and to say that for me it's an honor, very much so, and a pleasure to be able to participate in this and to be part of this special occasion. Well, among politicians, the media, and the public, I think it's fair to say there are lots of misconceptions and wrong notions about the Enlightenment, Verlichting, and its precise connection with modernity. The term is used more now than it was a few years ago, bandied about quite a lot in Dutch and in the British and American press and media. And I'm actually quite glad to have the opportunity to try to explain something of the crucial historical significance of the Enlightenment, of Verlichting, as well as of Spinoza. The two are very closely connected, of course, and try to show the central role of Spinoza in the development of the Enlightenment. It's not only Spinoza's uncompromising rationalism, his commitment to reason, and moral philosophy, but also his democratic political thought, an exceptionally powerful plea for toleration and freedom of conscience that are of direct relevance to us. It wasn't really, I think, at least people in the 19th century may have thought so, and the early 20th century, but for us today, it's not really the Reformation or the Renaissance, but the Enlightenment, the Verlichting, which can fairly be said to be the greatest, momentous, something happened to the mic, transition in terms of shaping what is best in modern life and providing our core values, basic human rights, as first spelt out by the Declaration of Rights of Man in August 1789. And of course, again, after World War II, the rights of man, basic human rights, as upheld by the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. But it's more than this, though it's perhaps an aspect that's well known. It was the less well known. It was the radical tendency in the Enlightenment, which I would argue begins with Spinoza, that forged the basic premises of the universal secular morality that underpins the democracy, the individual liberty, the freedom of expression and press, gender equality, race equality, and secular marriage laws, including the freedom of divorce, which is, of course, an integral part of modern marriage law. So a whole interlocking network, a system of principles that underlie the entire edifice of democratic modernity. If we want to continue to live in a free democratic society and have as neighbors countries and peoples that are also democratic and therefore wish to live in peace with us, that's a very interesting question, the relationship between universal peace and enlightenment. Perhaps there'll be an opportunity to say more about that later, but who would wish to live in peace with us. It's very important that not only children in schools, but also adults in our contemporary society should become more aware and be helped better to understand the necessary foundations, how modern democracy came to be, the premises on which modern social freedom, democratic enlightenment, enlightened modernity rests. Because it's complicated, it's not simple, and it's not straightforward, and it was difficult to achieve over a period of time. So it's true that some Enlightenment thinkers, moderate Enlightenment writers like Voltaire, Montesquieu, and David Hume only wish to go part of the way, to seek more toleration and individual liberty in society without introducing the principles of equality and democracy. Remember Voltaire, Montesquieu, even more Hume, very conservative philosophy. No democracy. We don't want that. He was quite a reactionary thinker. And they felt that way, And they also felt that some of they agreed that many abuses in society should be corrected, but there were many abuses that they ignored and were happy to leave uncorrected. Not least, of course, black slavery, which is a great blot on early modern Europe and all the empires of early modern Europe. And in many other respects, there were other things that we today would consider examples of gross inequality or abuses which were left uncorrected. That's why it's absolutely essential, before anything else, if you see in the newspapers or a politician or an academic scholar, and they start talking about enlightenment and they're not distinguishing between moderate enlightenment and radical enlightenment, you know straight away that this is nonsense. That person doesn't know what they're talking about, because you can't even begin the discussion without that distinction. Absolutely fundamental, because the Enlightenment split over this. Exactly the same once the revolution started, the French Revolution in 1789. They immediately split, because some people say, the more moderate conservative thinkers, well, we want kings and we want aristocracy and we want religious authority and so on. We don't think that that should be swept away, and therefore opposed to democracy. And the other ones said, no, we support the revolution, we want democracy and so on. So there's a fundamental split, and you must begin with that. There's no such thing, I think, as a discussion of the Enlightenment that doesn't begin with that. So it's always nonsense if they're not distinguishing between, I would argue, between moderate and the radical tendency. So the radical tendency, which was later continued in the later 18th century by such great figures as, or rather through the 18th century, by such great figures as Bayle, Diderot, Lessing, D'Holbach, Tom Paine, and Condorcet, who was not only a radical philosopher, but also one of the most important figures in the French Revolution, evolved this way of thinking, this radical wing of the Enlightenment, into a democratic movement, and a movement that was pressing for full freedom of expression, based on the idea that reason and science are the only true guide and the only secure guide in human life, guide for society and guide for politics. Against this, the limited enlightenment of Locke, Voltaire, and David Hume refused to accept that science and reason are the only basis of knowledge and truth, and that there is no other kind of authority in human life and politics which is legitimate, except the authority that rests on reason and science. So the moderate Enlightenment refused to accept that. The moderate Enlighteners, who got into quite a battle fighting against Spinoza's ideas, in his last years particularly, it's amazing how often in his letters and his essays Voltaire refers to Spinoza and gets rather steamed up in his references to Spinoza. And Hume doesn't speak about Spinoza very much, but makes quite clear his opposition to that radical democratic tendency. Well, they wanted to demonstrate the moderate Enlightenment, that reason might be useful for society in helping to reform abuses and creating a more tolerant society. All Enlighteners agreed about that. But it can't be the sole foundational force that Spinoza, for instance, strove to turn reason into, and they argued that reason must compromise with religious authority, with monarchy, and the aristocratic order of that time. Nor were the attacks of Voltaire and Hume the only strictures against Spinoza's rationalism and free thinking from within the philosophical camp. Many highly intelligent men, including numerous philosophers, have indeed been bitter critics of the Enlightenment. That, of course, is clear. And especially Enlightenment in its radical democratic format. Nietzsche and the postmodernists, amongst more recent thinkers, have rejected the Enlightenment. So one can't say that the entrenched, hardcore opposition that one finds in every part of the world through the 19th and 20th centuries, as well as today, to the principles of the Enlightenment, one can't, it would be an oversimplification to say that that's simply a consequence of bigotry and ignorance and stupidity. It often is, of course, a consequence of bigotry, ignorance, and stupidity, but there's much more to it than that. But the intellectual debates of recent years prove clearly enough, I would argue, that there are no sustainable or even vaguely valid arguments which are grounded on solid facts about the 18th and 19th century
which are really reasoned objections to the Enlightenment. What I'm saying is that although some very perceptive and intelligent thinkers have argued against the Enlightenment, I think, would also be true, of course, of Adorno and Horkheimer, two of the most acute critics of the Enlightenment in the early 20th century, there's always an element of confusion or something wrong with their facts, that the historical basis of what they're saying is wrong. I don't actually think there are any good arguments. By good, I mean that succeed in bringing a fairly cogent philosophical argument together with a correct historical explanation. That I honestly don't think is possible. You can't give There's no such thing as a good critique of the Enlightenment, although there are some brilliant critiques of the Enlightenment. Some philosophers, it is true, have offered brilliant critiques of the Enlightenment, but there's always an element of confusion. They've got their facts wrong somewhere. I sincerely believe that it is not possible to bring philosophy and history together, so let's say all the historical facts are correct, and then give a good critique. I don't believe anybody ever did that. And I don't believe anyone can do that. We'll see in the discussion afterwards. But I'm absolutely convinced myself that that is impossible. Nobody can do that. Well, one only has to look at the great onslaughts, almost terrible attacks on democratic modernity in the last 2 centuries or so, to become convinced that rejecting Enlightenment reason in the name of religious authority, mass populism, and tradition is the usual basis, indeed the essence of all forms of modern authoritarianism. So religious fervor, when I speak of the attack on religious authority, of course I don't mean personal, individual religious inspiration, which is often good, is often sincere, and is often deeply felt. What I'm talking about is intolerant, oppressive, militant religious authority, which of course has in the past been a very big problem, not least for Spinoza, who was of course thrown out of the synagogue by intolerant orthodoxy, and which is such a big problem also for us in the world today. And it's amazing how there are some really remarkable examples of how religious authoritarianism and authoritarian populism, either as a kind of proto-fascism or as actual fascism, have come together in many, many historical contexts since the end of the 18th century, when I think you can first see this syndrome emerging. At first, while it was led by adherents of the radical Enlightenment, that is, the French Revolution, I think in its early years, let's say from the Declaration of the Rights of Man in August 1789, while the real Democrats, Republican Democrats, dominated the revolution, so for 4 years or so, down to the coup d'etat, Robespierre's coup d'etat of June 1793, is not just democracy, but all those elements I referred to before, the freedom of the press, for instance, one of the most important. If you see the range of newspapers, and every opinion was allowed, even ultra-royalism, nothing was forbidden, nothing was suppressed, full freedom of expression, and full respect for everyone and for everyone's point of view, which lasted for 4 years. Of course, our picture of the French Revolution has been horribly distorted. I think we're often unfair to it, and many historians are in their books, because what came afterwards was so horrible. Well, nothing was more terrible than the terror. Nothing was more horrible than the proto-fascism of 1793 and 4. Nothing was more dreadful than Robespierre and his horrible friends. And the more, one can emphasize that as much as you want. That's all entirely true. But that's got nothing to do with the radical democratic ideas of the early revolution. And they made it quite clear. This is something historians don't emphasize very much, but Robespierre did. If you read Robespierre's speeches, he'll tell you in every speech, we don't want that philosophy, we don't want those philosophes, we don't want Enlightenment, we're against the Enlightenment. And he made this clear at every turn, and so he was a great enemy of the Enlightenment. So I think that we see an opposition between the elements of democracy as expressed by this radical Enlightenment tendency in modern history and the various different strains of authoritarian populism. They might be religious or they might be fascist in character. I myself see the Montagnards and Robespierre's movement with its, especially in its emphasis on the ordinary man's feelings, not on anyone's ideas, and the idea that the way ordinary people think is a single collectivity, that you can't really dissent from that. There's only one right way of thinking, and anyone that disagrees is going to be eliminated. You can see, I think, quite clearly the proto-fascist impulse in it, which is very strong, and when you read the descriptions of how they operated, you can see at once that this is the grandfather, if you like, of modern fascism and Nazism. So the democratic achievements of the early part of the French Revolution were in fact completely destroyed by this movement, the Terror in 1793 to 4, partly by a resurgence of this authoritarian populism, and partly by religious authoritarianism, another counter-enlightenment which became very strong also in the, and there were many rebellions in different parts of France in the later part of the 1790s. Just to give one example, because I think it helps us see it more clearly, of how these, the different strands of counter-enlightenment have often come together in modern history. I leave the French Revolution aside for a moment and look at the Spanish Civil War between 1936 and 9. And you see, it's very interesting how when the right was getting itself organized to overwhelm the Republic and to overwhelm democracy, so you had religious counter-enlightenment, the insistence that it's not reason or the common good that represent the true guide in society and politics, but faith and militant, this orthodox religious authority. They certainly worked together, hand in hand, to a large extent, and expressed themselves in terms of the need to reject Enlightenment ideas. That was, of course, a constant theme, and the claims of reason. And in fact, right-wing populism in Spain during the Civil War period was sometimes quite astounding in its ferocity. So they all claim that the people wanted a strong leader to adulate. It was a populist authoritarianism that loathed and rejected all democracy and free expression. And in some ways, an impulse that neatly converged with the religious crusade of the Spanish bishops at that time. So they were all denouncing Enlightenment together, and the modern intellectuals who stood for Enlightenment ideas for democracy and republicanism. But there were nevertheless some friction, an element of friction between these different strands, which is quite interesting. I was reading recently about one gathering under General Franco of the three key elements. So there were the bishops, who basically agreed with the generals, and there were the generals, and there you had some leaders of the Falange. But at this meeting, after agreeing on quite a few points, the Catholic bishops, the monarchists were there as well, of course, the generals. But one of the Falange leaders was getting so fanatical in saying we've got to eliminate all the intellectuals and the Enlightenment, he began shouting, he was rather carried away, and began shouting, abajo la inteligencia, down with intelligence. And the bishop started to get a bit nervous with that. That seemed to be going a step too far. So this sounded too crass even to them, too mad even for some of the fervent supporters of counter-enlightenment. But this Falangist speaker had a point. If democracy and free expression are to be completely crushed by authoritarian populism, you have to break the intellectuals, the intelligentsia, and you have to curtail intellectual debate. You've got to crush the Enlightenment completely. So in a sense, he was right, despite the madness of what he was saying. Religious authority and populist counter-enlightenment can't triumph for 100% without everyone shouting abajo la inteligencia. Everyone knows that there was no greater counter-enlightenment than Nazism and Hitler, and that German fascism suppressed freedom of thought more completely than any other movement. But all counter-enlightenment feeds on and encourages the ugliest, worst, and most destructive forces in human nature, including the today even stronger form of counter-enlightenment that seeks to fuse populism with religious authority and which insists that everyone, whether they like it or not, must submit to the rules of religion as laid down by self-appointed leaders of counter-enlightenment. So one of the most important features of Spinoza's thought must, I think we would all agree, be the realization that merely possessing the forms of a republic or democracy, the constitutional forms, is never enough to ensure that society really is a democracy in the sense of allowing freedom of expression and opinion and being organized for the benefit of the majority. Even a society with a fully democratic constitution can easily and very quickly be undermined and perverted to serve special interests. Spinoza shows this in a very detailed way, and even the forms of democracy can provide manipulators and schemers with the apparatus to introduce authoritarian populism, whether it normally would, of course, in the 17th and 18th century be in a more under the guise of religion, or without that religious guise. Once religious authority and the populist idea take hold, once the notion that ordinary people are a collectivity and that there's only one correct way to think and that this must be imposed on everyone, that no dissent is allowed, and that this authority is expressed by and this popular impulse and concurrence is expressed by an adored leader, no constitution or set of laws in the world is strong enough to withstand them. Possibly the most important and most relevant feature of Spinoza's philosophy for our world today is the manner in which he demonstrates in his masterpiece, The Ethics, just as much as in the Theologische Politik Traktat, that men's passions are a constant political danger to the group, to the community, to society, and that the forms of a constitution, the established procedures and practices of a state, cannot survive unless the process of enlightenment, of understanding, is brought into play. So unless religious authority, again, I don't mean the private, sincere religious inspiration of the individual, I'm talking about the intolerant, militant imposition of orthodoxy on society as a whole by religious authority. Unless religious authority defined in that way is drastically weakened and mass populism effectively countered, it doesn't matter how sophisticated a given democratic constitution might be, it's very easily overthrown or perverted from inside wherever opposition to the Enlightenment and to religious authority and populism gain ground. So, for instance, in Russia today, everyone knows that the anti-democratic tendencies become stronger in recent years. And if you look at the specific mechanics of the persecution, for example, of homosexuals and homosexuality in Russia today, you'll see that it is quite clearly a reflection of what I'm saying, a combination of religious authority or a pretense of religious orthodoxy very often, imposed as a political mechanism, even if strongly aided by ecclesiastical officials, combined with populist prejudice and bigotry appealing to the traditions, and especially the traditions of ordinary Russians, that forms the background of the repression. For democratic modernity to work, then, there has to be a prior revolution of the mind that neutralizes the danger posed by popular passions and prejudices and stabilizes political life, partly through education supervised by the state, education in which Spinoza urged the churches should not be allowed any considerable role. So, of course, by the time you get to Condorcet in the French Revolution, they clearly formulated the idea that modern democracy can't work unless you have universal education for everyone controlled by the state, removing religious control of education. If you don't give children and adults, for that matter, a secular education and teach them morality separate from religion, then democracy won't work. So that was already very clearly stated in the early part, so before everything I say about democracy and freedom in the French Revolution, always before Robespierre's coup d'etat. Once Robespierre is in power, everything is immediately reversed. Nothing more so than freedom of the press, I mean, they said they were going to do this with the dictatorship. They were going to repress all dissent, everything. No freedom of expression will be allowed. All the newspapers that criticized Robespierre, without any exception, will be shut down. They made that quite clear, and that's exactly what they did. They were shut down almost immediately. So everything that happens after Robespierre's coup d'etat is completely different and represents an entirely different ideology, which really has got nothing to do at all with the radical enlightenment, which is the central theme of the talk. So in Spinoza's time, there wasn't the possibility of the state instituting a universal system of education. So he tried to imagine, that's an important part of the TTP, or that there could be such a thing as a neutralized, rather reduced civil religion of basic moral rules, basically justice and charity and toleration. A civil religion expressed as theological rules for those who couldn't cope with philosophical arguments, but which would be taught by the state, by the civil authorities, and over which the religious authorities would have no control. So for democratic modernity to work, then there has to be a prior revolution of the mind that neutralizes the danger posed by popular passions and prejudices and stabilizes political life, partly through education, and creating an esprit public, a way of thinking about things, an accepted collective morality, if you like, which is not dictated for society by religious authority. So that is really an enormously important part of Spinoza's insight of what you have to have before votes by majority society as a whole agreeing that they will accept as laws or as decisions what the majority votes for. So democracy, our modern democracy, can't work without a certain ground plan of conditions in society, and that in turn depends on this revolution of the mind and this advance of the Enlightenment. Remember, the central point of Spinoza's ethics is to try to demonstrate for us what a moral order would look like, which is not dictated by religious authorities and which is not understood to be something that was revealed to humanity by God. If people accepted that laws and politics and the decisions that society makes only acquire their validity from basic moral principles, there has to be a secular moral order which society as a whole and which the political establishment accepts as the moral order of that society. So he wants to show what a secular moral order would look like. Separate morality completely from religion, and to, of course, he argued that the basic moral principles, since they're not something which are revealed to us by religious authority or by the divinity, that basic moral principles have to be understood as something that is relative to society. So what is good for society is good, what is bad for society is bad. And justice, charity, and toleration, of course, were among the most important of those principles. But it's interesting to see how basic to that, and it's directly connected with his conception of democracy, is the idea of reciprocity. You could say that what it boils down to really is that I will treat you and behave towards you as I want you to treat me and behave towards me. So if we treat each other as equals, we then have the best chance that we have to reach agreement and to form a society, to collaborate together and to form a society that works. And it's from the moral philosophy that the principle of equality receives its central position. It becomes so basic. So you can see from that how the political thought centering around democracy, how it's intricately connected with Spinoza's revolution in moral thinking. And that's one of the most important insights, one of the most important things to grasp about Spinoza's principles. So according to Spinoza, simply avoiding a life built on inadequate ideas, or the individual doing this, is by no means sufficient for reaching true freedom. The ideals of hermits and martyrs and Stoics are simply not ideals for modern society, he teaches us. This is where Spinoza's philosophy, I think, diverges most dramatically from, for example, ancient Epicureanism. If you read Lucretius, you'll see some of the same things you find in Spinoza, and that same desire to free the individual from their fears and superstitions, and to lead by leading a more rational existence and not being afraid of the unknown, having more grasp of the rules and laws of nature, the individual can be freer and be happier. So that's something you find in ancient Greek philosophy, or find it in Lucretius, you find that in Spinoza. But what you don't find in the ancients, which you find in Spinoza, is building on this principle of emancipation for the individual to show what that means in terms of emancipating the collectivity and building a society that can cooperate together. Actually, the argument about universal peace in the 18th century, which is not discussed very much in our own time, I don't know why, because we're just as much plagued by wars as they were in the 18th century when Frederick the Great's armies and kings were fighting each other all the time. 18th century, terribly plagued by wars. And it was already clear, on the basis of the thinking which I've tried to sketch out in the lecture this afternoon, that maybe the moderate Enlightenment thinkers would say, well, that's all nonsense, that's utopian. There'll never be a time when there's universal peace. There'll always be wars, and society can't move towards universal peace. But actually, it's a very good argument. If you think about it, of course, we haven't tried it yet, and maybe humanity will never progress to the point that there's enough enlightenment to try it. That's quite possible. But if you think about it, it's a pretty good argument, and I don't think it's very easy to bring critical objections against it. If you put in place the revolution of the mind, let's say in your society, and therefore you create a healthy and sound democracy based on collaboration that works, and your neighbors do that as well, so that the pursuit of the common good, the interest of the majority, is really the objective of the government in your country and in the neighbors' countries. If the interest of the majority, if it is a real democracy, if the interest of the majority is the principle on which the society works, then they won't fight each other, because it's never in the interest of the majority to fight wars. Wars are always fought in the interest of vested, either kings or religion, or vested interests of minorities. So if you had real democracies, they wouldn't fight each other, which is a pretty good argument, actually. It doesn't mean we're going to have democracies, and it doesn't mean we're going to have universal peace. But the principle is something that, if people become more aware of, already has a great and positive relevance, I think, for the way we think about politics and the way we think about social questions. I think I better stop, because there are frowns here in the front row. But I've set out the most important points that I wanted to make in my talk. Thank you very much for listening.
My name is Michiel Kortels. Thank you very much for this very nice and interesting talk. I have a question. I see that you make a kind of history, a learning process of democracy from the Greeks to Spinoza with respect to democratic thought. But what about a learning process with respect to a democratic approach in the full sense, in the radical sense, from Spinoza onwards? Didn't we, philosophers, but also civil scientists, learn from the practice, or trying to practice, democratic thought? And it looks as if with Spinoza we have everything, is the radical democratic approach. Is that right?
No, I don't think we have everything. I think two or three important elements, not just matters of detail, but important elements were introduced later. Of course, Spinoza doesn't discuss colonial issues very much, or the problem of slavery, hardly touches on that. You could perhaps work out that by implication, the slaves should be emancipated and the black peoples integrated into society. But as an explicit policy, a group of radical thinkers, actually Condorcet was one of the most important in that as well, setting up the Amis des Noirs in Paris in 1788. So as an explicit policy, that comes much later. I think that the idea that equality also has to include an economic element. So although they always disagreed, there were, of course, in the 17th and 18th century, militant levelers who thought the only way to have a really equal society is to confiscate the property of the rich and redistribute it. They thought that that would only lead to endless strife and civil war. What they did say about economic equality was that it is the duty of a democratic government. This is very clearly spelled out, both in some of the radical writers before the revolution, and it became the policy of the democratic republicans that I'm talking about, the Brissotins and Condorcet, that you, in particular through having progressive taxation, so the opposite of what, for instance, the Republican Party have been saying recently in the USA, you have to tax the super rich much more heavily than other people, partly through progressive taxation, partly through the laws governing inheritance to break up big states and big, very heavily taxed large inheritances, that it is the duty of the democratic state always to work against and not in favor of economic equality, but to do it in an orderly and legal way, not through outright confiscation. So that there was an economic dimension which is not really spelled out very much in Spinoza. The other thing, of course, is the equality of women and feminism, which becomes an extremely important part of this movement, and an extremely important part also of the French Revolution and its democratic phase. So it's terribly important between 1789 and 1793, and for the first time women's political organizations are set up. Actually, Condorcet's wife, Sophie de Condorcet, was one of the most important of 4 or 5 women who were very prominent in the first major women's movement to change something which was, of course, incredibly unequal in the world in early modern times. And this aspect is not really gone into by Spinoza. So I would say that the ground plan and the basic arrangement of ideas and the basic logic is put there by Spinoza, but certain very important dimensions working out of the implications of it come only later, with the full development of radical enlightenment in the later 18th century.
A question on the perspective of thinkers like Spinoza on our modern democracy through representation. Would thinkers like Spinoza consider our system of democracy through representation as a true form of democracy?
Well, this whole tradition that I'm talking about had actually a very sophisticated discussion about representation, in many ways more sophisticated than ours, because they were worried about, they certainly very clearly, there's no question about that, were trying to institute, at least for men, and it was, in fact, of course, proclaimed in 1792. So you have universal suffrage for men. They all vote. You have your deputies in the assembly. They make the decisions. So that's representative democracy. But is representative democracy in the form we have it actually enough? They didn't think so. So they also wanted a system of petitioning and of a mechanism for protests and so on from local assemblies. They thought there had to be a kind of dialogue between the legislature, the democratically elected legislature, and with an element, not too much maybe, but an element of direct democracy. So a real democracy, a real modern democracy should be representative democracy with an admixture of local direct democracy as well. So it's quite a complicated concept, more sophisticated than we have most of the time, I would say. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your insightful speech. My question is about this movement you're talking about. The idea of Spinoza, the initial thought, which has been put on paper, and then has its own kind of way of going. And you're talking about radical enlightenment, and that's basically what you refer to as Spinoza's thought, correct?
Well, that would be a little bit of an oversimplification.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, so allow me to be very simple, because I'm not a kind of scientist as you are. But that's how I perceive it. And you also explained, I mean, that was very new for me to see the French Revolution also in that light. But it was kind of captured by Robespierre, and that's it.
Exactly, yes.
So where are we now? Where are we now, and where is it visible? And how can we engage ourselves to make this happen?
Where are we now? I think we have democracies in the Western world which are imperfect ones, and I think most people can see worrying signs here and there, and sometimes feel nervous or anxious about the political future and the future of society, because they see this. It's not for me to say anything about Dutch democracy, because I don't live here and I don't know as much about it as most of you do. But in the American case, for instance, you can see how certain elements in the Constitution, certainly certain elements in the way presidential elections take place and so on, are a little bit worrying, and suggest that democracy is not altogether secure in all senses. So even if we look at the Western world, we see a problem. If we look at Russia or the Middle East or other parts of the world, or China, we see an even bigger problem, a much bigger problem maybe. And so everybody has good cause to be worried about the future of democracy, and everybody has good cause to consider what the weaknesses of our actual democratic practices today are.
Dank u wel.